I remember days moving quickly, not in a loud way, not in a way that felt urgent, just moving. Mornings arrived before I felt ready for them. Evenings showed up before I realized the day had already passed. It wasn't that anything bad happened. Most days were fine. Nothing went wrong. That was part of the problem. I didn't feel busy. I didn't feel stressed. I felt slightly behind. Something I couldn't see, like there was a pace everyone else understood, and I was always a step out of rhythm with it. People talked about time as if it was running out. Deadlines, aging, years going by too fast. But that didn't quite match what I felt. It wasn't panic. It was quieter than that. It felt more like time had already moved on, and I hadn't noticed. The moment it did, I would sit down for what felt like a minute, and suddenly, it was night. The room looked the same. Nothing dramatic had changed, and yet, the day was gone. Sometimes, I tried to remember what had filled the space between morning and evening. Most of the time, nothing stood out, not because the day was empty, but because it passed without leaving a mark. For a long time, I assumed this was normal, that this was simply how life felt once you reached a certain point, that everyone walked around with this quiet sense of being slightly late. It wasn't uncomfortable enough to question, just subtle enough to ignore. There was no single moment that caused it, no clear beginning. It was more like a background feeling, always there, rarely noticed. A sense that something was always just ahead of me, not something specific, just something. I would tell myself I'd slow down later, pay attention later, be more present later. Later felt reasonable, later felt responsible, later didn't feel like avoidance, at least not at the time. I didn't feel lost. I didn't feel unhappy. I felt untouched, like life was happening close to me, but not fully landing. Moments came and went without settling. Conversations ended without anything being said. Weeks passed without friction. And because there was no friction, I didn't stop. I mistook the absence of pain for the presence of clarity. Sometimes I'd catch myself wondering where the day went, not in a worried way, more like mild surprise, as if time was something that kept slipping out of my hands without ever being dropped. And then the feeling would pass. I'd move on because there was always something next. For a while, I thought being rushed meant moving fast, running late, juggling too much, trying to keep up. But most days, I wasn't actually moving at all. I was sitting, standing, waiting. The rushing lived somewhere else. It showed up between things, between one moment and the next, in the quiet spaces that didn't have names. I'd look back at a week and feel like I'd missed it, not because it was bad, nothing went wrong, but because it passed without ever settling into me, like it never fully arrived. People would ask how I'd been. I'd say, fine, and I meant it. I wasn't lying. Fine felt accurate, but fine didn't mean present. It meant untouched. It meant nothing had asked very much of me, and I hadn't offered very much either. I kept assuming clarity would show up later, after something happened, after something changed, after life slowed down on its own. It felt reasonable to wait. Waiting didn't feel passive. It felt patient, but nothing changed. Days kept moving at the same quiet pace. Weeks folded into months, months into years, and I stayed just slightly behind them. Not lost, just not fully inside them. I started noticing how often I said, later, not out loud, internally. Later, I'll pay attention. Later, I'll feel more connected. Later, I'll understand why this feels unfinished. Later became a place where I put things I didn't know how to hold. Unfinished thoughts, unasked questions, feelings that weren't painful enough to interrupt the day. They accumulated, quietly, like dust in a room you still use every day. The strange thing was how ordinary everything felt. Life didn't feel dramatic. It felt smooth, too smooth. Days slid past without resistance. And because there was no resistance, I mistook it for balance. I thought ease meant alignment. I didn't realize ease can also mean absence. Sometimes I would catch myself midday and wonder where I was rushing to. There was no deadline in front of me, no immediate pressure, just a background sense that I shouldn't stop, as if stopping would mean falling behind, even though I couldn't say behind what. I didn't feel anxious. I felt slightly unfinished, like something had been paused and never resumed. I thought this feeling would pass on its own, that it was just a phase. But phases usually announce themselves. This one didn't. It blended into everything else. It became familiar, and familiarity has a way of convincing you that nothing is wrong. It was much later when I noticed something else, not all at once, more like a quiet shift. The rushing hadn't come from time. Time had been steady the whole time. It had come from the way I carried each moment, as if something was always waiting behind it. Not something specific, just the sense that this moment wasn't the one yet, that the real one was still ahead. I didn't realize how long I'd lived like that, how often I was already moving past what was happening while it was still happening. I was present enough to function, not present enough to feel the weight of it. Expectations have a way of settling in without making noise. They don't arrive dramatically. They stay. They become part of the background. So do unfinished thoughts, unnamed feelings, moments that don't hurt enough to remember, but don't land enough to stay. Nothing in my life had actually sped up. The days were consistent, predictable. What changed was the way I moved through them, always slightly leaning forward, always prepared for what came next, even when there was nowhere to go. At some point, I stopped waiting for things to slow down, not because they did, but because I noticed how quiet everything had become. Not empty, just quiet. A quiet that made room for noticing. I could finally hear the rushing I'd been carrying for years, not because life had been moving too fast, but because I never felt allowed to stop expecting the next moment. There's a difference between stillness and stopping. Stillness happens on its own. Stopping feels like permission. I didn't realize how rarely I gave myself that, how often I treated the present like something to pass through instead of something to stay with. Now, the days feel different. Not better, not worse, just more noticeable. Light on the floor lasts longer. Silence feels heavier and gentler. Memories arrive without being invited, not to teach me anything, just to sit beside me. I don't think anything was missing. I think I was just rarely fully there. And noticing that doesn't fix anything. It doesn't undo anything. It just changes the way the moment feels. When it finally has your attention. Life doesn't feel rushed now. It feels full, not in the way I once imagined, in a quieter way, a way that doesn't ask me to move or prepare or become anything else.